Captain Eric Tavish had negotiated treaties with the crystalline Valdry, navigated tense ceasefires with the territorial Kresh, and once talked down an entire battle fleet through nothing but carefully chosen words and strategic pauses. In 12 years of diplomatic service, he'd built a reputation as someone who never stumbled, never improvised badly, and certainly never said anything that wasn't calculated 3 moves ahead, which made his current assignment both a tremendous honor and a source of persistent anxiety that had him reviewing cultural protocols for the 15th time as his shuttle descended toward Sylthari. The Sylthari Empire had maintained polite distance from humanity for 40 years, ever since first contact established that they were technologically advanced, politically stable, and profoundly uninterested in the messy business of galactic politics. Their borders were closed to unauthorized travel, their trade limited to carefully controlled exchanges, and their ruler, Empress Kaelith, had never once appeared in any public recording or accepted direct diplomatic contact. Until 3 weeks ago, when the Empress had surprised everyone by requesting formal negotiations with the Terran Alliance. The diplomatic corps had scrambled to assemble a team, and somehow Eric had been selected as primary negotiator. His briefing materials were extensive but frustratingly vague on crucial details. The Sylthari valued formality and protocol above all else. Their Empress was described as formidable, unyielding, and emotionally inaccessible. One report suggested she'd once stared down a military coup through sheer force of presence without saying a single word. Captain Tavish, we're approaching the palace landing zone. His pilot's voice interrupted Eric's frantic mental review of proper greeting protocols. Surface control is guiding us in. They're very particular about approach vectors. Everything about this culture is particular, Eric muttered, straightening his formal diplomatic uniform one more time. How's my translator working? All systems optimal, though the briefing said most Sylthari leadership speaks perfect English. They consider linguistic adaptability a mark of sophistication. Perfect. One less thing to worry about, and one more way he could accidentally cause offense if his phrasing wasn't precise. The shuttle settled onto a landing platform that seemed carved from a single piece of luminescent crystal. Through the viewport, Eric could see the palace rising above them, architecture that looked grown rather than built, organic curves and sharp angles existing in impossible harmony. Everything glowed with soft bioluminescence, and Eric had to remind himself that this wasn't just aesthetic choice. The Sylthari themselves were bioluminescent, their skin marked with patterns that responded to their biorhythms, and if the cultural notes were accurate, their emotional states. Though according to all reports, Empress Kaelith's patterns never changed. Perfect control at all times. A delegation met him at the landing platform, 4 Sylthari officials in formal robes, their skin patterns dim and formal blue. They greeted him with precise courtesy, verified his credentials, and led him through corridors that made him feel like he was walking through the interior of a living gemstone. No one made small talk. The silence was professional and absolute, broken only by the soft sound of footsteps on crystal floors. They stopped before massive doors etched with patterns Eric couldn't interpret. One of his escorts spoke for the first time since the initial greeting. The Empress will receive you in the throne of stars. You will approach to the designated mark, deliver your formal greeting, and await her acknowledgement. Do not deviate from protocol. Do not speak out of turn. Do not. I understand, Eric said, keeping his voice calm despite his racing heart. I've reviewed the protocols extensively. The doors opened, and Eric stepped into the most magnificent chamber he'd ever seen. The throne room stretched the length of a cathedral, its walls and ceiling composed entirely of crystal that refracted light into cascading patterns. Bioluminescent fixtures provided gentle illumination that made everything seem to glow from within. At the far end, elevated on a dais of woven silver metal, sat a throne that looked like frozen starlight. And on that throne sat Empress Kaelith. Eric had seen holographic representations in his briefing materials, but they'd been distant, low resolution, clearly taken without permission. Nothing had prepared him for the reality of her presence. She was tall by human standards, her posture absolutely perfect, her formal robes incorporating patterns that seemed to move in response to light. Her face was elegantly structured, with those distinctive Sylthari pointed ears that swept back gracefully. Her skin bore bioluminescent patterns in silver and deep blue, shifting with subtle complexity across her features like starlight on water. But it was her eyes that struck Eric silent. Violet and ancient and utterly, completely unreadable. He realized he'd been staring and immediately began the formal approach, walking to the designated mark on the floor, a subtle pattern in the crystal that indicated exactly where supplicants should stand. His mind raced through the prepared greeting, the formal acknowledgement of the Empire's sovereignty, the carefully worded proposal for beneficial relations. Empress Kaelith watched his approach with the attention one might give an interesting specimen. Her advisors, 6 of them flanking her throne in precise formation, regarded Eric with expressions that ranged from neutral to barely concealed hostility. The silence was absolute, broken only by Eric's footsteps. He reached the mark and executed a formal bow, the one he'd practiced 100 times. Most honored Empress Kaelith, sovereign of the Sylthari Empire, guardian of the Crystal Throne, I bring greetings from the Terran Alliance and Premier Nakamura, who extends recognition of your authority and wishes to establish relationships of mutual benefit between our peoples. His voice carried clearly in the crystalline space, and Eric was proud to note it didn't waver. Perfect delivery. Kaelith inclined her head precisely 1 degree, the formal acknowledgement of proper greeting. When she spoke, her voice was melodious but cold, each word precisely articulated. Captain Eric Tavish of the Terran Alliance, your credentials have been verified. We are prepared to hear your preliminary proposals regarding trade relationships and information exchange. You may proceed with your initial statement. Eric launched into the prepared speech, outlining potential areas of cooperation, emphasizing mutual advantage, carefully avoiding anything that might sound like demands or assumptions of Sylthari interest. He'd given hundreds of similar speeches, and this one flowed smoothly despite his nervousness. Kaelith listened without visible reaction, her expression carved from ice. The speech concluded. Kaelith responded with equally formal statements about the Empire's position, her voice never varying from perfect diplomatic neutrality. Her advisors occasionally whispered information to her, which she acknowledged with minute nods. Everything proceeded exactly as Eric's briefings had predicted, formal, cold, mechanical. Then Kaelith rose from her throne to formally acknowledge the Alliance's credentials, a ceremonial gesture that Eric's protocol said indicated willingness to continue negotiations. She descended 3 steps from her dais, moving with fluid grace, and as she entered the direct light streaming through a crystal window, something happened. Her bioluminescent patterns caught the light in a way that made them flare more brilliantly, silver and blue cascading across her skin like liquid starlight. The effect was breathtaking, transforming her from merely beautiful to something that seemed almost beyond the physical. For one moment, Empress Kaelith looked less like a political figure and more like a work of art given life. Eric, who had maintained diplomatic composure through war zones and crisis negotiations, who prided himself on always having the perfect phrase ready, found himself staring with his mouth slightly open. The prepared response, formal acknowledgement of her gesture and transition to specific negotiation points, vanished entirely from his mind. What came out instead, in a voice filled with genuine awe and absolutely zero diplomatic filtering, was, "You're so beautiful I can't even speak." The throne room fell into silence so complete that Eric could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Every single advisor froze. Kaelith herself stopped mid-gesture, her hand extended in formal acknowledgement, her expression shifting from cold neutrality to complete shock. Then, as Eric watched in horrified fascination, the Empress's bioluminescent patterns flared bright pink across her cheeks and down her neck. She was blushing. The ice-cold Empress who reportedly never showed emotion was blushing like a teenager receiving her first compliment. For approximately 3 seconds, no one moved. Eric's brain screamed that he just committed a catastrophic diplomatic error, that he should immediately apologize and try to salvage the situation before getting expelled from Sylthari space. But his mouth seemed disconnected from any rational thought process, because instead of apologizing, he just kept staring at the pink luminescence spreading across the Empress's features with something approaching wonder. The advisors gasped audibly, actual sounds of shock breaking their rigid composure. One of them took a step forward as if to intervene, but Kaelith raised one hand sharply, stopping the movement. The pink glow intensified briefly before she visibly fought it down, her jaw clenching with effort as she forced her bioluminescence back toward its normal silver-blue patterns. It didn't entirely work. A faint pink flush remained across her cheekbones, pulsing stubbornly despite her obvious concentration. That was. Kaelith's voice came out slightly strangled before she caught herself and forced it back to formality. That was highly inappropriate, Captain Tavish. Yes, I apologize, Your Majesty. Eric finally found words, though his diplomatic training seemed to have abandoned him entirely. That was completely unprofessional. I don't know what. You don't know what possessed you to make such an observation during formal negotiations. One of the advisors, an older Sylthari male with patterns of dark green, stepped forward with barely controlled outrage. Captain Tavish, you have violated every protocol of proper diplomatic conduct. Such personal comments are. Advisor Threllis. Kaelith's voice cut through the objection with quiet authority. The pink had faded from her patterns now, though Eric noticed she kept touching her face as if checking that her traitorous bioluminescence had returned to normal. I will handle this matter. She looked directly at Eric for the first time since his outburst, and he saw something in her expression that hadn't been there during the formal proceedings. Genuine uncertainty, as if she had no practiced response for this situation. Her patterns flickered briefly toward pink again before she controlled them. Captain Tavish, while your comment was indeed inappropriate for the context, I acknowledge that you appeared to speak without calculation. Her formal composure wavered slightly. Was it truly unintentional? Eric could have lied, should have lied probably, claimed it was a diplomatic gambit or cultural misunderstanding. Instead, he found himself responding with the same thoughtless honesty that had gotten him into this mess. Completely unintentional, Your Majesty. I looked at you in that light and every prepared statement just vanished. I've never done that before. I'm usually much more professional. The corner of Kaelith's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the first hint of any expression beyond ice-cold formality. I see. That is unexpected. Your Majesty, perhaps we should adjourn these proceedings, another advisor suggested nervously, given the breach of protocol. No, Kaelith's voice was firm. She straightened to her full height, and Eric saw her consciously assembling her composure like armor. We will continue. Captain Tavish has apologized for his lapse. We will proceed with substantive discussions. What followed was the strangest negotiation session of Eric's career. The formal structure remained: proposals and counter-proposals, discussion of technical details, acknowledgement of mutual interests. But something fundamental had shifted. Kaelith engaged with actual curiosity now rather than mechanical obligation. She asked questions that seemed driven by genuine interest rather than diplomatic necessity. Her advisors kept glancing at her with barely concealed confusion, clearly unsettled by this deviation from her normally rigid behavior. And occasionally, when Eric made a point she found interesting, or when their eyes met across the formal distance, Her bioluminescent patterns would flicker briefly toward pink before she caught herself and controlled them back to neutral colors. By the time the session concluded with agreements to continue detailed negotiations, Eric had recovered most of his professional demeanor, though he noticed himself being more carefully honest than usual, as if the initial breach had made calculated diplomatic speak feel wrong. Kaelith maintained her formal bearing, but the absolute ice had thawed into something slightly more approachable. As Eric prepared to leave, performing the formal departure protocols, Kaelith rose from her throne. For a moment he thought she was simply acknowledging his exit. Then she spoke, and her tone carried an edge of uncertainty that seemed deeply out of character. "Captain Tavish, a moment if you please, privately." The advisors stirred with alarm. "Your Majesty, that would be most irregular," Advisor Threllis began. "I am aware of what would be irregular, Advisor." Kaelith's voice carried quiet steel. "I am requesting a private audience with our guest. You are all dismissed." The advisors filed out with visible reluctance, casting concerned glances back at their empress. When the massive doors closed, leaving Eric alone with Kaelith in the vast throne room, the silence felt different, less formal, more uncertain. Kaelith descended from her dais completely, closing half the distance between them. Without the formal context, she seemed more human somehow, despite the alien grace and bioluminescent patterns. She studied Eric for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know what you did in there, Captain Tavish? Made the worst diplomatic blunder of my career." Eric offered, trying for levity despite his nervousness. "You made the Empress of the Sylthari Empire blush in public." Kaelith's voice was carefully neutral. "That hasn't happened in 30 years. In fact, it's never happened during my entire reign." Kaelith gestured toward a smaller chamber adjoining the throne room, and Eric followed, feeling increasingly like he'd stumbled into a situation that no briefing had prepared him for. The side chamber was more intimate, with comfortable seating arranged around a table of crystalline material. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Sylthari capital sprawled below them, a city of luminescent spires and organic architecture that made human cities look harsh by comparison. Kaelith sat, and after a moment's hesitation, Eric joined her. She studied him in silence, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through subtle variations he couldn't interpret. Finally, she spoke. "Sylthari leadership are trained from earliest childhood to control our emotional responses completely. Our bioluminescence betrays feeling, so we learn to suppress the biological reactions. For royalty, this control is absolute. An empress who blushes in public is considered to have catastrophically failed in her discipline." "I'm sorry," Eric said quietly. "I truly didn't mean to cause." "Stop apologizing." Kaelith's tone was sharp, then softened. I'm not explaining this well. What I'm trying to say is that for 30 years I have maintained perfect control. I became the ice-cold ruler my people expected. No weakness, no visible emotion, nothing but absolute authority. I learned to suppress even the biological responses I cannot consciously control. I became an icon instead of a person. She looked out at the city, her expression distant. And then a human diplomat walks into my throne room, looks at me with complete unfiltered awe, and says something so thoughtlessly honest that 30 years of conditioning just vanished. For a moment, I was simply someone receiving a genuine compliment, and my body responded before my training could stop it. Eric watched the play of colors across her skin, no longer rigidly controlled, cycling through blues and silvers and occasional hints of that same pink. "You sound like you're not angry about it." "I should be furious." Kaelith turned to face him directly. "I should have you expelled for causing such embarrassment. My advisors certainly expect it. Instead, I find myself—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Grateful. Grateful. For 30 years, no one has spoken to me with unfiltered honesty. Everyone measures their words, seeks advantage, fears causing offense. You looked at me and said exactly what you thought without calculation or agenda. Do you know how rare that is? Eric found himself smiling slightly. Ironically, my entire career is built on measuring words and calculating responses. What happened in there was probably the least professional thing I've ever done. Perhaps, Kaelith said, and something in her expression softened. The most important truths slip out unguarded. They sat in silence for a moment, and Eric realized the formal barrier between them had dissolved entirely. This wasn't Empress and Diplomat anymore. This was two people having an unexpectedly honest conversation about loneliness and masks and the weight of always performing. Can I ask something potentially rude? Eric ventured. Kaelith's patterns flickered with what might have been amusement. After what you already said, I suspect we're past worrying about rudeness. When you blush, is it involuntary? Like human blushing. Completely involuntary, which is why we train so extensively to suppress it. The bioluminescence responds to blood flow and hormonal changes we can't consciously control. Strong emotion triggers the response before we can prevent it. She touched her face self-consciously. Which means when you made me blush, I was genuinely flustered. Everyone in that throne room knew it, including me, and there was nothing I could do to hide it. For what it's worth, Eric said carefully, I meant what I said, not as diplomatic flattery or manipulation but as genuine. Awe, I suppose. You're remarkable, and not just because of your position or authority. The way you carry yourself, the intelligence in how you speak, even the way you're willing to have this honest conversation instead of hiding behind formality. It's all remarkable. The pink glow returned to Kaelith's cheeks, stronger this time, spreading down her neck and across her collarbones. But she didn't try to fight it down immediately. Instead, she looked at Eric with an expression that mixed vulnerability and wonder. I don't remember the last time someone made me feel seen rather than observed, she said quietly. I understand that, Eric replied. Different context, but I spend so much time being the perfect diplomat that I sometimes forget there's a person underneath all the careful phrases. Kaelith stood and moved to the window, her patterns casting soft light across the crystal. Eric joined her, and they stood side by side looking out at the city. After a moment, her bioluminescence shifted to warm gold. A color Eric's briefing had mentioned indicated contentment or peace. She caught him noticing and didn't try to hide it. Gold is considered the most private of colors. We usually show it only to very close companions. Should I feel honored or concerned that you're showing it to me? Perhaps both. Kaelith turned to face him, and there was something different in her expression now. A warmth that hadn't been there in the throne room, an openness that felt deliberately chosen. Captain Tavish, I have a proposal that my advisors would consider absolute madness. Given how this day has gone, I'm almost afraid to ask. A smile, genuine and unguarded, transformed Kaelith's face. These negotiations will require multiple sessions over several weeks. Standard protocol would have you staying in formal guest quarters with minimal interaction beyond scheduled meetings. Instead, I'd like to invite you to stay in the palace itself, with less formal arrangements for our discussions. If we're going to build meaningful agreements between our peoples, perhaps we should start by actually knowing each other. Eric's diplomatic training screamed that this was highly irregular and potentially problematic. But looking at Kaelith, at the hope and vulnerability in her expression, at the warm gold still glowing across her skin, he found he didn't particularly care about protocol. I'd like that, he said simply. Though I should warn you, if you keep looking at me like that, I might say something thoughtlessly honest again. Kaelith laughed, a sound of pure delight